business has completely walked over to the other side. So virtually every single formal leader in the business community is a deployee either of the ANC or the SACP or COSATU. Certainly the majority of business leaders were previously on the labor side of the social partnership. So business has essentially completely given up in terms of wanting to be led properly in a social partnership with government and labor. So there's no one fighting for businesses' rights. There's no one leading business in the process. And the reality is the vast majority of medium, which is below 50 million, and large, which is essentially above 50 million rand turnover in terms of how government defines it, the vast majority of those companies are keeping their heads underneath, are simply trying to avoid the radar, and are hoping that it's business as usual. Exactly the opposite of what they should be doing, quite frankly, because in fact it is now that they should be militating, it's now that they should be organizing, but there's just no political will amongst business. Business has been browbeaten to the extent that they've bought the narrative and the rhetoric of the social partnership, which is you're lucky to have your business, you're lucky to be white and in South Africa and successful, so just don't upset the apple cart. And that unfortunately is the reality. As far as individuals are concerned, I think that the vast majority of individuals, black or white in this country, are not wanting to pay tax if they can avoid it. The vast majority of people making an income in this country are making an income, again, under the radar and not declaring that income. I mean, we know for a fact that 125,000 businesses in this country are paying in excess of 30% of the tax base in this country. That's the reality. We know, and we know that so 125 out of 500,000 registered businesses are paying 30% of the tax base in this country or more. It's far worse in the individual tax-paying community. We've heard, for example, Helen Zille say that if she's not happy, and one never knows when she's happy or not happy, but if she's not happy, at some stage she might lead a tax revolt. We don't need to look to Helen Zille to lead a tax revolt. The tax revolt should be led from within the business community. But we do not have brave business leaders in this country. We have business leaders, and I'm talking here across the entire spectrum. I'm talking within your spectrum. I'm talking within the medical aid spectrum. I'm talking within the construction spectrum, who are so intent on operating under the radar, they will never put their heads above the parapet and say, well, follow me because I think it's time to do something effective in this country. And that's essentially what government is depending on. Government is depending on the fact that you are so happy as a white male just being allowed to continue to run your business. You are so happy as a white male who may be Jewish, maybe Christian, maybe Muslim, but the reality is you are so happy just having a certain amount of religious freedom that you want to run your business, you want to make an income, you want to look after your family, and you want to remain a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew in a country which is not going to necessarily curtail your rights in that regard, that you are not going to focus on what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is you need to tighten the purse strings. You need to essentially throttle access to funding so that they realize that if they carry on in this way, they're not going to have a tax base to talk about. That's never going to happen because there are no longer any brave white male or female people left in this country. Let's be honest about that.
If you don't mind, and we actually need to start, but I just cannot let this question go because I really want to hear your answer on this. The question is, Menachem Kay is not that guy, I can assure you. I'm not that brave guy you're referring to. But if I were to be, in other words, it wouldn't be me, it would be Ivor Blumenthal. I have a two-part question. Number one, do you have the political freedom to do so without fear? That's the first question. And the second question is the cabal of government strong enough to destroy you? In that way that you keep on reading about in the paper. And, you know, one of the things that I love about talking to you is that your great ability to see through, to not hear the noise, to see the facts and to see the balance. So the question here is, if I were to be that brave enough bloke to stand up and to fight against this, firstly, is that doable?
All right, so let me answer your question here. A week ago, this is how quickly things are changing in South Africa. I would have said to you the greatest asset that would keep anyone wanting to live in South Africa and stay in South Africa is that we had a free and an open and a bright constitutional court, our pinnacle court. A week ago, I would have said that. But we've subsequently had what must be the most disappointing constitutional court ruling of all time in the history of the world, let alone in South Africa, or rather, confirmation that even judges on the Constitutional Court are either politically bent or have to bend to the political pressure and will at some stage. We've seen a massive caving by the Constitutional Court to support most probably the most innocuous judge in the history of the bench of this country, and that's Jody Collipin, who came out and said that the Minister of Small Business and the Minister of Tourism were correct in applying racial lines in how and who would get survival, disaster-based survival grants in this country. So a week ago, I would have said to you, depend on the Constitutional Court, depend on our legal system. What this last week has taught us is that even the Constitutional Court is prepared to bend to the political pressure and political will in this country. And the bottom line is, so are you asking me if any brave person was prepared to stand up and lead a tax revolt, if any brave person was prepared to stand up and say, well, come for us, we're ready for you, the bottom line is that brave person would need to know that they're doing it without a legal system which is impervious to pressure. I'm not saying without judges who are not going to stand up against pressure, but certainly this last week has left me a little destitute of hope in that regard. Having said that, equally, we've got some of the best lawyers in the world, and we've got them in our community. We've got them in the minority community, that's the Jewish and the Muslim community in this country, and certainly within the Afrikaans community. We have some of the best legal minds in the world. So the reality is, even with bench judges, and I don't want to say bench judges on the Constitutional Court, because let's just say they erred this one time, but certainly bench judges on every other bench in this country. Even with those bench judges, we have some of the best legal minds in the world that can easily run rings around those guys and make it impossible for them to make the wrong kinds of decisions. So from a legal point of view, you can still depend to some extent or another on the fact that the law is going to protect you. From a defense force, from a justice perspective, unfortunately not. We know the quality of our South African police services. We know the quality of the defense force in this country. The reality is, all you can hope for is support from the international community, ironically, exactly like the ANC hoped for prior to the release of Mandela. But all you can hope for is the support of the international community. But you've got a problem there. Solidarity, Dirk, went to the United Nations and said to the United Nations, this was 5 years ago, please declare affirmative action illegal. The United Nations said, why should we do that? They put an absolutely watertight case to the United Nations. The United Nations said, you know what, the way it's being interpreted in South Africa, that it is affirmative action for the majority and not the minority in the country, we think it is illegal. We actually think that it doesn't have a foundation of sense or justice. And so we're going to declare it illegal. The United Nations declared affirmative action, by the way, to be illegal. It's not made an inch of difference in South Africa. It's not made an inch of difference in our relationship in the global or international community, to the extent that our president is president of quite a few fora in the international community today as we speak. So in answering your question, you're going to have to do it alone. Now, what does alone mean, Nachi? Alone means you're going to have to buy guns, you're going to have to buy tanks, you're going to have to buy bullets, you're going to have to hide them, you're going to have to use them when it's appropriate, you're going to have to not use them when it's appropriate. You're going to have to essentially start a revolutionary arm in this country if you're going to be brave enough to overthrow the government in a non-political context. But there's a better political context. Instead of doing all of that, rather go the other way. Go the way of the frog. But instead of seeing yourself as the frog, see these idiots in the National Executive Committee as frogs. See these people in the ANC who are literally sucking millions of rands on an individual basis out of the fiscus just to sit and sleep in Parliament. See them as the frog. And quite frankly, as far as the flyer is concerned, get the people who vote for them to see how absolutely inept and useless they are. The one saving grace in this country, I think, and I had a major argument about this yesterday, but the one saving grace in this country is this, that there is a young cohort of black person in this country, male or female, who are world-class. They can be on a stage anywhere in the world, and in fact, unfortunately, many of them are trying to immigrate or were trying to immigrate before COVID. But for me, that's a saving grace. It is a saving grace if we can nurture, if we can identify, garner, and nurture those individuals into a truly rainbow middle-class community in this country. If we can, they will be the saving grace, not only of South Africa, but of Africa. If we can't, and they become disaffected, then the reality is, Nachi, it's those people we have more to fear than a Julius Malema or a Cyril Ramaphosa or whoever in this country, because they are going to make sense. They're going to use facts, they're going to use statistics, and they're going to use rational arguments to browbeat you into the ground, and you're not going to be able to compete. So it's what we do with that resource that I think is going to determine whether or not this country is going to survive.
Wow. So, ladies and gentlemen,
we haven't started yet, have we?
Started. You've actually been very privileged, in my opinion. I think I've been very, very privileged to be listening to Dr. Ivor Blumenthal, CEO of ArkKonsult, as he's been giving perspective. I mean, this has just been a conversation between a very fortunate and happy Menachem Kay and Dr. Ivor Blumenthal. Dr. Ivor Blumenthal, I've long been calling the crusader and the warrior for truth and justice in South Africa. One of, as you've just been hearing, one of Ivor's great gifts is his ability to see through all the noise that we hear all the time. He's a master of perspective, of balance, and as you've clearly heard, of articulation. So I just want to take 2 minutes in the midst of all this just to give some housekeeping. What's going to happen is the moment I'm finished talking, I'm going to block all of our videos and mute all of us. Dr. Blumenthal will have the floor for the next hour or so. You can see at the bottom of your screen that the third from the left of the icons, there's one that says chat. If you go onto that chat function, you can send a private message to your advisor, or you can send a message to everybody. You can WhatsApp your advisors or myself, and they will then send those through to me, your questions. And so when Dr. Blumenthal is done, we will then pose questions to him. I'm sure as he's speaking, you've already posed some questions or got some questions. So ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, because I want to shut up and actually listen to Dr. Blumenthal. Dr. Blumenthal, please continue.
Is that me? My name's Ivan.
Ivor Blumenthal, my apologies.
So thank you for the opportunity.
We have a problem. Dr. Blumenthal?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Nafi?
By mistake as well. Sorry, please go on.
Okay, no problem. So you've asked me to speak about a couple of things, and for me, most probably the most prominent is this, that at this moment in time, we have an opportunity. South Africans have been laid up. They've essentially been laid off on a temporary basis to be at home because of social distancing and because of everything that's going on around COVID. And in that process, because they've been laid off, a UIF fund of 40 billion rand was created to see out the April, May, and June periods, to allow them to stay at home, ostensibly quarantining themselves with their families and as little social interaction as is possible. Now that's happened around the world. It's not just South Africa, and they've got different labels for it around the world. So for example, in the UK, you've been furloughed, where you get 80% of your salary from the government. Whereas in South Africa, the amount you get from government out of what is referred to as the temporary employee relief scheme is anything from 60% at the very lowest levels of your salary to 38% at the very highest levels of your salary. But there's something. Now, what's interesting is this. Another context, nothing to do with COVID. The fourth industrial revolution. Well, there is a fourth industrial revolution and there's a fifth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is the notion that people are going to be replaced by technology, machinery, and equipment. Why? Because it's more productive that way. You get a 24-hour shift, you get far less error rates, and you certainly don't have trade unions, you don't have annual increases, etc., etc. I don't have to tell you about that. The fifth industrial revolution is slightly different. It says there's technology, but technology could sit side by man or woman, and it can be integrated into people's jobs without them necessarily having to lose their jobs. I always use the example of thinking about the United Kingdom and thinking about Holland. In Holland, we're very much into the fifth industrial revolution, where people and technology are being brought into coexistence. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it's very much the fourth industrial revolution. Let's replace people with technology. And I'm generalizing, obviously. But the reality is this, that almost 5 years ago now, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, have said to governments around the world, we're sorry, we've created technology, or we've created a spurt in technology we almost cannot control, and we have no intention of controlling. And we understand that one of the disadvantages of having done that is people are going to lose their job, whichever way you look at it. And the apologists will say, yes, they'll lose their jobs, but they can be retrained to do other jobs. Only an idiot would believe that in this day and age, people are not going to lose their jobs because of the advent of technology, the advent of technology in industry, the advent of technology in society, et cetera, et cetera. So only an idiot would say the same amount of people are going to keep their jobs, but they're going to be retrained to do other brighter things, more sort of right-brain stuff. So if that's the reality, now comes COVID-19, which forces people to stay home and forces government to try something. Governments around the world. So what is TERS, the Temporary Employee Relief Scheme in South Africa? What's the furlough scheme in the UK and in the US and all over the world? It is nothing other than a precursor to what is going to become known as the basic income grant. The thing that Zuckerberg, Gates, Musk, Bezos, the thing that they've been asking governments to do for the last 5 years, if not longer, because they realize that their technology is going to cause, and is already causing, job loss around the world. So in South Africa, the politician next year that puts up his hand and says, what I'm campaigning on is to take the TER system, the Temporary Employee Relief System, where there was initially a 40 billion Rand fund created for April, May, and June. It's likely it's going to be extended for July and August and most probably September. And in some industries, such as the restaurant industry, maybe all the way up to November. But to take that temporary employee relief program, which is not working at the moment, and if you've been waiting for TERS, you'll know what I'm talking about, but will eventually start working once they bring the programming away from India and back to South Africa in the Department of Labor, but it will eventually get working. But that's a precursor to this thing called the basic income grant. And so the reality is governments around the world, but our government in particular, is getting ready to begin paying people, not 350 Rand a month, but the kind of money they've been paying on TERS to compensate people, particularly qualified people, to stay at home because they can't get employment. And the politicians and the political parties that understand that and start lining their campaigns up to actually campaign on the basis that we will consolidate the big grant, the basic income grant, we'll consolidate it, we'll make it part of civil society, we'll make access to it easy and simple, so you don't have to stand outside the UIF or the SSA or Social Security offices to actually get and collect your money every month. But we'll create a seamless access to that basic income grant. That political party is going to win the hearts and minds of South Africa. And that political party doesn't necessarily need to be a black political party in South Africa if it's making the right noises and it has the right financial and economic argument as to where that money is going to come from in the first place and how quickly it's going to get paid out and disseminated into civil society. And mark my words, we're starting next year with elections, and we will have elections on an ongoing basis. Remember that local government and provincial governments are always 2 years apart from one another. I mean, national governments are always 2 years apart from one another. So every 2 years, this rhetoric is going to kick up again. And basic income grants are going to become more and more important in South Africa and around the world. The reality is, think about your life over the last 2 months. You've started doing other things. You've started teaching yourself how to maybe build a website. You've started reading more, either physically or online. But the reality is you've been forced to find a level of relaxation, a level of diversification, left and right brain of your own personality and your mind and what you're doing. And in fact, it's enriched most things, including your business, your family life, et cetera, et cetera. So the health of having a basic income grant is undoubtable. So think about it again, and I'm just going to summarize the point. TERS, temporary employee relief, which is a mechanism for dealing with the fact that people have been temporarily laid off, is going to become a basic income grant, which is going to be set to stay for the rest of existence, or at least for as long as tax is collected in the country, and there's a certain amount of discretionary funding available for SARS and governments to be able to dish out. It's critically important you understand the basic income grant issue, though. The issue is that the people who do enter the workplace on a full-time basis are going to be people who are exceptionally technically talented, mostly are the left-brain people who are able to build technology, and to a lesser extent are the right-brain people who are able to integrate and sell technology into normal business processes. So if you said to me, where should my child be going? My child should either be going on a left-brain basis into building technology, from robotics all the way through to programming, or programming all the way through to robotics, and micro-robotics as well, very, very important. Or alternatively, and ask yourself, why do we have 2 new universities that have been built in South Africa now by Blade and Zamandi, where specifically the majority of faculties in those universities are humanity universities? Because of the marrying of the right-brained creativity in being able to integrate and sell technology into normal business processes, working alongside with the technological developments which are happening in technology, but a percentage of people who leave school, a percentage of people who enter the workplace, unfortunately. And the rest of people, well, the trades are going to become more and more important in the short term until such time as they mechanize. But the majority of people, unfortunately, are going to be people on that basic income grant, one way or another, going in and out of that basic income grant. The real question, the real challenge in South Africa is, if we don't have enough money to create a basic income grant that's going to be sexy to people, how do we stop this race to technological solution? How do we stop the capitalization process in almost every single business, irrespective of what it is, to slow it down to the extent that the tax base and the basic income grant can catch up with it, to make people all right about the fact that they have to stay home, all right about the fact that essentially they're on the dole for the rest of their lives, but at the same time to encourage the people who are able to enter the workplace to do the kinds of qualifications that we might have poo-pooed, we might have thought are passé, and really historically maybe have not been that sexy, including, by the way, philosophy. Because if you think about the technological advances and the impact that philosophy is going to have on those technological developments, do I pull the plug or do I not pull the plug, for example? When is something okay and when is it not okay? Does a technology company have to have an ethics panel, an ethics officer, a compliance officer who's a philosopher rather than necessarily an accountant? Very interesting debates into the future that I think we're all going to be having. But the notion is, as a country, do we head down a capitalization path where we replace people with machinery and equipment, which a majority of CEOs are saying when, not if? Or do we figure out a way of being more and more labor intensive? As a government, for example, do we stop allowing companies to make deductions, tax deductions, cost deductions on capital expenditure where there is a bleeding of people from the workforce? These are the kinds of debates that are going to preoccupy us over the next decade, at least in South Africa, in terms of policy development. So this notion of a basic income grant is something that is academics are starting to write about, governments are starting to debate and talk about. The majority of governments are saying, well, we're beyond debate. We've started the process. Furlough, TERS, that's the beginning of the process. Let's see how it works. Let's see how the population takes to it. I think in South Africa, there's some major mistakes that have been made around TERS, which are going to come back to bite. Our Minister of Labour, who, by the way, is a Communist Party deployee into cabinet, but our Minister of Labour has, for the last 3 weeks, been setting business up against its own employees, to the extent that I've been mediating strikes almost on a daily basis for the last week and a half. So he's been setting these employees up using TERS, the Temporary Employee Relief Scheme, against employers, which I think is just stupid, quite frankly. But then again, that's our Minister of Labour. The bottom line is that properly managed, in any country around the world, I think it's a political winner. If Julius Malema puts up his hand and says, I stand for the basic income grant, he will consolidate that additional 15%. There's no argument in anyone's mind, irrespective of how it's going to get done. Irrespective, because when you think about a basic income grant, that money's got to come from somewhere, and invariably it's got to come from Social Security funding. So it's basically just rebalancing the budget to make those payments. And then it's taking 350 Rand as a grant and increasing it to at least 3,500 Rand, as is the minimum grant with the temporary employee relief scheme that we've got at this moment in time. So that's the first point that, Nachi, you've asked me to talk about, which is the basic income grant. But let's now talk about something that is very close to my heart at the moment, and that is the effect that COVID is having on the retail sector in South Africa. The most obvious effect of that is that everything is going online, everything is going digital. But the reality is that there are machinations at play here. And for me, the biggest evil besides insurance companies and what they've done to individuals and to companies in the course of COVID by simply contracting out of force majeure, acts of God, or supervening impossibilities, besides them, for me, the most evilly inclined grouping of business people in this country has to be landlords, particularly shopping center owners, particularly landlords who are aligned to the South African Property Owners Association. And by the way, they call themselves PIGS, the Property Industry Group, 3 associations working together, in terms of what they are doing to small independent retailers. Because the reality is, when you look at the impact of COVID on the small retail sector, and you understand two things. You understand, number one, that these small retailers have been forced to move into shopping centers because property developers and landlords and pension funds, sorry, Nachi, but pension funds and banks and insurance companies have built shopping centers with a view to completely devastating high street shopping so that they can force all of those retailers who ordinarily would be in their own property on the high street selling their goods, as you find in many European countries and North American countries, cities around the world. In South Africa, we don't have high street shopping. We have completely shopping center retailing going on. And that was conscious. It was a conscious architectural strategy of developers acting with politicians, local and national government politicians, over a protracted period of time, and it's been extremely successful. We've seen the demise of high street shopping in South Africa, and we've seen retailers, particularly small retailers, completely at the whim of landlords, pension funds, insurance companies that own these shopping centers. And we are seeing an absolute decimation of small retail shopping in South Africa because of it. For me, one of the greatest crimes of COVID is this, that businesses were told they have to lock down, and restaurants have been told you're going to have to lock down until level 1, unless you want to send your takeaways to your customers in one way or another. So businesses have been told you're in lockdown, you can't make turnover. Ostensibly, every business in the country was told, unless you're an essential service, you're in lockdown. Without defining shopping centers or property owners as being in the essential services business, they were not on the list. They defined themselves as being essential services. And so their entitlements in terms of a lease agreement with a retailer that's completely locked down, has no turnover. The shopping center owners have said, well, we still want our rent. At the best, we're prepared to defer some of those rental payments. But even though you've got no benefit out of the shop you've rented from me, we still want our rent. Now, for me, that's a crime. And the point I'm making here when I talk about insurance companies and insurance brokers and property owners is that the day of reckoning is coming. There will be class actions. And those class actions, from a landlord perspective, will exact a huge amount out of those landlords because of the way they've decimated retail, and particularly small independent retail in this country. Very short-sighted, by the way, because all they're doing is driving those retailers onto the internet. But they want their money. And insurance companies. Huge problem for insurance companies is looming as follows. about 10 or 15 years ago, when the pandemic started to really hit, MERS, SARS, all of the other stuff, the insurance companies knew that in some sectors they couldn't run away from acts of God or force majeure. They wouldn't be able to sell insurance policies, mining sector, et cetera, et cetera. So they would sell their insurance policies into those sectors and charge a huge premium in the event that one day there might be a pandemic. But they realized they couldn't do that for the country as a whole, beyond some of those key sectors. So what they did was they conspired to conceal the fact that they had facts. They had the research to show that within a 10-year period, there would be one or more pandemics, which hit businesses, which hit individuals in this country. But they conspired in a way amongst themselves and then with their brokers to hide those facts from their customers and clients, because they knew their customers and clients would just not be able to pay the kinds of premiums necessary to cover themselves unless there was mass buy-in. So as a result, we have this COVID thing, and business owners thinking, well, I'm covered for business interruption, only to find out that they're not covered for business interruption, even though they took out a policy for business interruption, because very cleverly, there were exemptions and exceptions in relation to force majeure, acts of God, and supervening impossibility from a commercial perspective, commercial law perspective. I think there's a mass class action coming. Well, not I think, I know there's a mass class action coming by businesses, not because insurance companies contracted out of the process or convinced insurance brokers to contract out of the process, but because it was intentional, because they had facts and figures they weren't prepared to release to the public at large. So I think that if you have shares in insurance companies and insurance broking companies, not now, but certainly over the next 5 years, you might very well want to re-examine which businesses you're investing in. Because like I say, I see a massive class action coming after level 1, which is going to devastate that sector unless they've got massive reserves in place. Because the reality is businesses have gone to the wall already, not in the future. Businesses have gone down, they've gone to the wall. Owners of those businesses are literally just closing their doors and leaving their assets inside those shops for the landlords to grab hold of, because of the fact that they thought they had business interruption cover when they didn't have business interruption cover. And I know, by the way, I'm very happy, Nachi, that this is being done virtually and not in your offices, because I know at that stage you would have taken a gun out and shot me. But that is unfortunately the reality. The final thing I want to talk about, and then we can have discussions, is this. And you and I spoke about, well, not the final thing, but the second last thing is this. That governments are not permanent. So the best example, well, in fact, we've got two great examples. The rise and rise and rise of Cyril Ramaphosa into his position now as the legitimate president of South Africa, and the rise and the falter and the rise and the falter of Boris Johnson into his position with the largest majority that the Conservatives got for I don't know how long. And then comes COVID. And COVID becomes the great equalizer, the great leveler. Because irrespective of what these governments do, there is a fork that says you can either go for health or you can go for economy, but you can never go for both of those things together. Historically, we've been hit by coronavirus before, we've been hit by Ebola, we've been hit by SARS, I don't have to tell you, MERS, etc. Historically, we've always gone for the economy, which means we take a knock. We know we're going to lose 1 or 2 million people every year around the world. We'll put it down to flu, but we know it's MERS or SARS or coronavirus. We have to do that. The actuaries are telling us we have to do that so that the economy doesn't falter. This time is different, because this time I think the libertarians in governments around the world have said, you know, let's try to do things differently. Let's try to save humanity and see how much of a knock the economy can take. So there are two theories in that regard. We're either trying to save humanity and seeing just how far we can push the economy and pull the economy back just as it gets to the precipice. Or alternatively, we start thinking in our minds that maybe this is a dress rehearsal. Maybe this isn't a health economy argument and how it's being managed, but maybe it's a dress rehearsal for a lot worse to come. What we haven't seen around the world, except in one country, and I think it was Venezuela, I'm not certain, but what we haven't seen around the world is the suspension of ordinary democracy. In other words, a state of disaster is not the suspension of parliament. It's not the suspension of ordinary democracy. And we've not seen a suspension of ordinary democratic structures around the world, except for maybe one country. But the reality is, the majority of government in terms of a dress rehearsal are realizing that they have to start practicing for that time, when whether because of the climate or because of much more malevolent viruses, they're going to have to be in a position where they've got enough money to see themselves through for a year at least, where they've got the goodwill of the public that's practiced on something like COVID-19 previously and knows what's coming and knows how hard everybody's trying. So they've got money and they've got goodwill. But at that stage, you're going to see the suspension of parliament. At that stage, you're going to see the fact that there are 70,000 Defence Force troops on the street who, quite frankly, are not in your face this time around. But being practiced enough to understand what deployment means, to the extent that when that real event comes around, we're going to see a much more draconian, totalitarian kind of system implemented, not just in this country, but around the world. And so if you take the view that it is a dress rehearsal, then how you look at governments is how have they managed this dress rehearsal. I don't think that the average citizen in any country, but certainly South Africa, I don't think that 40 million people in this country out of 58 million people have the patience or want to exhibit the discernment, even if they've got the discernment, and I'm suggesting they do have the discernment. But I don't think those 40 million people are going to want to say, well, this is the government trying, this is the government really trying to do everything they can in every single division of government, and therefore we're not going to hold it against them. I think those 40 million people have already made their minds up as to who they're going to vote for now in the next election, because either they're a drinker or a smoker. But the reality is, I think that our government has a ticking time bomb on its hands. If it cannot delay the next set of elections, I think it stands a very, very real chance of not being the government in power, irrespective of who that government in power is going to be. And we had this discussion waiting for the session to begin now. And it's the same in the UK. Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, they've lost a huge amount of goodwill by how they've managed themselves in the lead up to lockdown, during lockdown, and presumably after lockdown as well. We don't even need to talk about Donald Trump, and he's only got 2 to 3 months to pull back what he's lost in, quite frankly, bumbling through the management or the mismanagement of this thing. Governments around the world. The reality is, I think there are two governments that have managed to come out with their head held high. The Spanish and the Italian governments. And when you look at Spanish and Italian politics, and you look at the trajectory of just how many people they lost, how they've recovered, how they're now opening up their economies, irrespective of the fact that people are still dying of this thing, I think that they've come out relatively unscathed as governments. They've come out battle weary, and their people are behind them seeing that they're battle weary. I do not think that people perceive our government as battle hard and battle weary. I think they perceive our president. But remember, you don't vote for president. You vote for political parties in South Africa. And so from a government stability perspective, I think that the jury is out on whether or not this government will last another election. If it lasts the next election, then it will continue to be the government that's here to stay. But the frank truth is that unless something miraculous happens in the next 10 months in South Africa, certainly from a local government perspective, if not from a national government perspective, we might not see an ANC government. We might very well see a purely South African Communist Party government that breaks away from the alliance. We might even see a workers' government, COSATU-based government working with the SACP and not necessarily the ANC. Because I don't know if this tripartite alliance, the social partnership between the ANC, the SACP, and COSATU is going to hold up another election. Cyril himself had to do a hell of a lot of work before the last election to keep those three components together in that partnership. And I just don't know if it's strong enough to be held. And I don't know if there's a political will to want, as politicians, to hold it together come the next set of elections. It'll be very, very interesting. So coming back to your initial point, Nachi, is there a knight waiting to ride in on his horse, basically to save the population, to save the country, and essentially to unseat an absolutely inept, corrupt, totally useless, jailable National Executive Committee, if not whole political social alliance? Who is that white knight going to be? You suggested someone like Herman Mashaba. I think Herman Mashaba is dead in the water. Besides all the bumbling and the nonsensical comments and statements he makes, I just don't think that going over to the dark side has served him any purpose in now wanting to appeal to 50-odd million people in this country who are never going to vote Democratic Alliance and who still in their mind see Herman Mashaba as a democratic sellout. So I don't think he's the solution. I think there are some positive solutions, and then there are some solutions you need to be very wary of. And obviously, the wary solutions are people like Julius Malema. The warier solution is Black First, Land First president. And then there are some potentially, possibly better solutions. Those better solutions, by the way, you might need to dig deep within the current structure of the ANC, not the SACP, to find, but there are some up-and-coming real heroes within those movements. They're unspoken about, they're unnotified, people don't know that they exist, but they are there. The real question is, how quickly can they be catapulted to the front to be able to save the ANC? That's an interesting question about the stability of our own government in South Africa. So I've spoken. I know you wanted me to leave 15 minutes for questions. I've only left 10 minutes for questions. I do apologize, Nachi. Maybe you want to kick off with a question or two.
Thank you, Ivor. Firstly, I want to say that I could listen all day, honestly. And if you want more time, genuinely, before I hand over to questions, there is more time available for you. So if you want it, just tell me now, and I'll gladly hand it over. Or
can I have a little bit more time?
Pleasure.
All right. You asked me to address something that I was purposefully skirting. And that is the issue of broad-based Black economic credentials, okay? Because you were talking specifically about the fact that there is this perception, quite rightly so, and I referred to the Constitutional Court, but there's this perception that unless you are a Black-owned business, you do not qualify for government grant in the time of COVID. And it's very true in relation to two specific grant categories. Grants coming out of the small business ministry and grants coming out of the tourism ministry. But there are other grants, grants which have been created by Rupert, by the Oppenheimers, by the Motsepis, or should I say by Menachem Kay. But the reality is those grants do not necessarily have a broad-based Black economic empowerment criteria as to who gets them or who doesn't get them. And the reality is that in relation to broad-based Black economic empowerment, the Constitutional Court has said this, that COVID doesn't suspend the law of the country. And if the law of the country is government only gives money to broad-based Black economic empowerment compliant businesses and individuals, then it's only right that those government departments use those criteria to determine who's going to get the benefit and who's not going to get the benefit. They'd have to be idiots to assert that, and they have asserted that in the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has said they're correct. But socially, morally, ethically, they have proven how bereft they are of anything decent. So we know now that our government, led by Cyril Ramaphosa, unfortunately, is bereft of decency. But decency doesn't win political elections. And so they've used racial lines to determine who's going to get the majority of the benefits from those two particular divisions. And I have no doubt that while all the other grants, the aid and relief grants which are available, I have no doubt that even though there might not be racial criteria are being applied as to who gets the major part of those benefits and who doesn't. Very much like the food parcels. If you're white, you don't get food parcels in South Africa. If you're a foreigner, you don't get food parcels in South Africa. And 9 times out of 10, if you're not linked to a minister in the National Executive Committee, you don't get food parcels in South Africa. So we know that there are unspoken criteria and there's spoken criteria. You judge a government by its spoken criteria and it's being judged to be racist. No other way of looking at it. And in fact, the Constitutional Court has supported the government in being racist. So we have institutionalized racism that's come to a head during the most needy time of individuals and businesses in this country. That's the reality. I had the displeasure of reading a ridiculous article by Bonang Mohali yesterday, where he stood up for broad-based Black economic empowerment as an academic. In fact, it was obviously written by some academic. It was well written, by the way. It was a good argument. But the notion that he could justify and support BEE to the extent that he supported it, that's what I have a problem with, especially as Black leadership in South Africa. But what it did indicate, though, is how completely captured our government is by the Black Management Forum and Black leadership generally in South Africa. Every single decision they make in terms of benefit to civil society is based on, first and foremost, women, the youth, but essentially the Black beneficiary. We're never going to get away from it. We have to face up to the fact that you have to be prepared to be a second-class citizen if you're a white male in this country. You can be a wealthy second-class citizen who's going to manage to protect their assets in one way or another, but you're always going to be a second-class citizen. We have a class-based society, and it's based on race. There's no question about that. Again, I know I use this term often, but only an idiot would argue that we do not have a race-based class society in South Africa. That's the last thing I wanted to mention. Am I positive? I still believe South Africa is the only country in the world to be, because at least our problems are transparent. We see the problems. We can deal with the problems because we can touch them. It's racism. It's bigotry. It's hypocrisy. It's the murder of the female gender at the behest of the male gender. We can touch our problems. We can see our problems. So we're beginning in some way or another to deal with the problems. You go to any other country in the world, problems like those are not transparent. They're inherent, but they're not transparent. So would I want to be anywhere else in the world? No. We know what we better the devil you know, essentially. Nothing.
Ivor, thank you. Thank you very, very much. It leaves me somewhat flummoxed as to what to say first. I mean, obviously, it's also very difficult to know which are house views that Octagon can postulate and which are opinions, but ultimately it's a very, very difficult times, and we've received a number of questions, Ivor, that I think so I'd just like to start with him, if you don't mind. And the first one comes from Mark. Mark asked the following question. He says, with the exceedingly low tax base in South Africa, how is the basic income grant, and this is now in parentheses for me, any other grants, how are they going to be realistically funded going forward and sustainably? You mentioned that a lot of these grants are not temporary things. They're going to go into perpetuity for as long as there's a tax base, you're clear to say. What do you think? How is it going to be funded?
So I called the Minister of Employment and Labour an idiot, and now I want to operationalize that characterization. Basically, he's got 100 billion rand to play with in the unemployment insurance fund. He's taken 40 billion out of it, and that 40 billion is there for purposes of the temporary employee relief scheme. What he hasn't calculated on is the fact that his very actions, his personal actions, are going to alienate the business community to the extent that they're already capitalizing, but they're going to increase the amount that they're capitalizing. And capitalization means you buy equipment, you put equipment in, you write the equipment off over time, and you replace people with the equipment. So because of his actions, his personal actions in how he's managed this tourist system, he is going to be a major cause in the capitalization of the workplace into the future. When I say him, I'm talking about his Politburo behind him, and you saw them all 2 weekends ago on television in the Department of Employment and Labour. But they are personally going to be responsible for the fact that we have a capitalization of the workplace and a labour contingency in the workplace that continuously diminishes. Now, the problem is that with the calculation of BIG, the basic income grant, they're going to be very dependent on a UIF that is stable, if not growing. But the reality is, with fewer and fewer people to cover, what's going to happen is that the UIF is going to shrink from 100 billion down to 60 billion now. It will replenish 20 billion, but it'll never get up to 100 billion again. And the reality is fewer and fewer people are going to have UIF paid on their behalf. And so as a result, governments are going to struggle more and more not to have to subsidize the basic income grant from other parts of the fiscus. And other parts of the fiscus are all of the other departmental budgets which have nothing to do with labor and everything to do with productivity and DTI and everything to do with social security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So over time, we're going to run out of money because governments are going to do two things. They're going to capitalize, but they're also going to go offshore as quickly as they can. And so they're going to run their surpluses, they're going to run their profit margins down to the bone. And as a result, and we know Edward Kieswetter has said this, the commissioner of SARS, he said this. We're already seeing it, and we're anticipating that it's a problem that's going to grow. And it's essentially because of individual comments, individual statements, and idiots rather than bright people running those ministries. If Cyril knew what he wanted to do, if he had the ability to do what he wanted to do, we would see massive numbers of deployments into government ministries in this country from the private sector. But we're not going to see that, or where we see deployments, they're going to be deployees of the ANC-SACP-COSATU alliance. And they know they can ride that out for a decade or maybe 2 or 3 generations, and that's all they individually want. They want to be secure with their trillions, and they want their kids to be secure. I mean, it's for the people taking over to have to deal with the fire sale.
Right. So
now, that doesn't mean that as business, we simply accept that. What we do as business is we create an alternative economy. And you're already seeing an alternative economy being created in the white Afrikaans community, where they're saying we are going to discount our dependency on government tenders. We are going to create an artisan base. We're going to create a professional base, and we're going to trade amongst ourselves. If it means we're going to have to barter, we'll barter. But we're going to do everything we can to make sure we run an alternative economy. And I think more and more you're finding businesses not in the white Afrikaans community who are looking to participate in alternative economies. And so that, unfortunately, is going to be the reality of not just South Africa, but countries around the world.
Can I interject just on that topic? I mean, as many middle class South Africans, no, far from it. As many middle class South Africans, we've all privatized so much of our lives, whether it be from education to healthcare to security to retirement funding. I mean, do you see that as a long-term solution that's potentially sustainable? I mean, or is the efforts of government to broadly socialize everything going to eventually erode those? I mean, we're seeing the threats of it with NHI, at least in its early guises, but there could be so many other features that do, unfortunately, minimize or put pressure on the standards of living that we all working very hard to build for ourselves.
So let's start with schooling. You've already seen the Minister of Basic Education say that at least just in the time of COVID, I'm going to want to take more of a controlling interest over private schools. In the healthcare sector, you've seen exactly the same, although quite frankly, I think they're going to be faltering to the extent they're simply not going to be able to do without the private sector in the healthcare environment. But the reality is every single government department. I mean, I walked out of a meeting yesterday where a charter code was being discussed for the media, advertising, and communication sector, which was promulgated in 2016, but government has not managed to implement. And instead of government saying, well, let's hand it over to the private sector that can do a better job, because we know they can do a better job, government was saying we're going to take more of a controlling interest in that particular charter code. We saw the same thing with mining, where business just fought back and said it's not going to happen. So yes, every single government department at the moment is trying to grab control of every private sector, including, by the way, alternative energy, including, by the way, transport, where they're just not giving up on SAA, but now they're going to have SAA Part 2 being developed because they want to hold control of those particular purse strings. Alternative energy. Government has said, well, we now believe it's a fantastic idea to have windmills and power pumps and everything else. But we're going to have a national company actually managing those things. It's not going to be the private sector. So every single element of our civil society, government want to grab hold of in terms of being able to manage those purse strings. You're quite correct. It's not going to go away.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost my own access. I'm coming in via Neil's computer. Another question was, I thought, quite a brilliant question. You know, take a looking at the schooling system and how the schools have behaved. Just give us your opinion on that. You know, I know you've still got one child in school, if I remember correctly, and we're still being asked to pay full school fees. So here's the question. It's actually from Larry. Private schools are sending out pleas and letters to parents to please pay school fees. What are your thoughts at the current time?
So I was having a discussion. When I went for a walk this morning, and I didn't see you on the road, by the way, Nafi, but I was having a discussion. And what I was saying to the guys is two things. I was saying, number one, let's face facts. Many, if not the majority, of people who either have been paying fees to churches, mosques, and synagogues, or people who have previously been paying fees to schools, many of them, luckily, are most probably reduced in their income, but not bereft of income. So that's the first point. Not as many people have been affected by the lockdown to the extent that it would justify the absolute broad range of saying, sorry, we can't pay school fees or we can't pay church fees or whatever it is. That's the first point I wanted to make. Second point I wanted to make is foresight. If you honestly believe that starving a school of its budgeted income is going to do your child any good in 3 months' time when they have to go back to school, then quite frankly, you're an idiot. Because the teachers are not going to hang around unpaid. The facilities are not going to fix themselves up. The water's not going to keep flowing through the pipes once it's closed off. The bottom line is you have an obligation to your child, if not everybody else's children, to actually make sure that the businesses continue to operate. Now, what we've seen the schools do, to their credit, is say, you know what, we realize it's not first prize, but we're going to teach online, and we're going to get better and better and better as we teach online. And I was sorry, I just dropped my earpiece. Just give me a second. I was a huge critic, by the way. You can hear me, right? I was a huge critic of the idea that schools were not responding quickly enough to this requirement. I was a huge critic of that. Sorry, I'm going to do this. You can hear me, right, Nafi?
Perfectly well.
Oh, all right, fine. So I was a huge critic of the fact that I didn't see schools responding. But what I learned is that in the background, they were doing a huge amount to be able to be of service to these kids, remembering that these teachers had never been online teaching before, that this curriculum had never been adapted to online teaching before. And yet in a relatively very short period of time, literally 4 weeks, suddenly they were running schoolrooms online from 8 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Unbelievable. And over time, being able to assess online. The real question is this: how are these kids going to be walked back from that when these schools open? Because there's a level of productivity that these teachers are now suddenly managing to get through online that now has to be replicated backwards into the school classroom. And I think as much of a jump that there was in getting online, there's going to be an equal jump that needs to be prepared for now, getting back into the schoolroom and having a longer day to essentially do the same kind of stuff with. So in answer to your question, don't be an idiot. Do not write off having to pay school fees for 1 or 2 or 3 months simply because of the fact that you think you can take the gap. Because to many people, and I'm generalizing. So let's say to 40% of the people out there, 40% of the people can afford to pay their school fees. Pay your school fees to preserve your kids' school, let alone everybody else's kids' school. That's as far as school fees are concerned. As far as synagogue and church fees are concerned, exactly the same argument.
Oh, thank you for saying that, Ivor. I appreciate that, because I felt I need to give a personal disclaimer. I have sat and do sit on many shul boards and community boards and school boards, and in my various guises, it's long been one of my greatest bugbears, how a parent believes that they can, or a congregant believes they can withhold their fees because of an individual grant. Because that means that the teacher or the rabbi or the priest can take his individual gripes out on you or your child. And I have a very serious issue with that, but obviously, Ivor, you and I have a common view on that.
Can I say one thing there? Say one thing there, Nafi? Tell yourself this: when it comes time for you to pass on and cross the barrier, and you didn't support your church or your synagogue or your mosque, so your American-born rabbi or imam has happened to go home because he hadn't he wasn't deriving an income here in South Africa, who's going to bury you? Someone who's going to stand up and say, well, I didn't know the deceased, but this is what the son tells me and the wife tells me, etc. Well, someone who says, I knew Nahi. I can tell you personally what he did for this community. So the issue is this: what sort of investment are we making with a short-sighted thing? Well, we're going to be like everybody else. We're going to take the gap. We're not going to pay our synagogue fees or mosque fees. We're not going to pay our school fees for a 3 or 4 month period. We're going to feel good in ourselves that we managed to somehow avoid and duck the system. That's just stupid.
Ivor, clearly you and I have common views. Unfortunately, I don't think that our views are entirely in common with others. Let's move on to another question. Before COVID, unemployment was at 29%, and in brackets it says here 40% real. I don't disagree with either of those two comments. We're likely to hit over 50% when the dust settles. USA's worst was the Great Depression, was around 29%. How do we in South Africa, if at all possible, recover, and how long do you think that will take? I know it's an economic question more than a political question.
No, it's a different question. There's a different question. Do we want to recover? So if we own a business and we can easily take the gap, I can show you how to do it in 5 minutes, all right? You can easily take the gap in your business to implement a Section 189 process and trim half of your staff tomorrow. Well, within 3 weeks, all right? In terms of labor law, it's a watertight way of doing it, and you have the optimum excuse, which is COVID-19. So the bottom line is not how do we avoid a bloodbath in the job market? Do we want to avoid a bloodbath in the job market? And I think there's a deeper question. I'm jaded. I've spent a week and a half in negotiating with trade unions, so I'm jaded. The real question is, has labor done enough to earn the right to remain employed in South Africa? I'm saying no. I'm saying individually, workforces I've come across over the last week and a half have quite frankly acted like pigs in relation to their employer. And so as a result, don't deserve to remain employed simply because of what they've done to those employers over the last week and a half that I've seen, spurred on and egged on by trade unions. So I don't think labor has done enough and is not doing enough today to deserve the right for the employer to make a decision. I'm going to remain a labor-intensive environment. I'm not going to move towards a capital-intensive environment. Because at least until now, we are still allowed to have a capital-intensive trading place in South Africa, which means we're allowed to bleed labor as much as we want. And I can show you how to do it. It's not difficult to do. The question is, do we have the political will to want to do it? And more importantly, if we don't want to do it, is it because labor, the people who work for us, the people we've trusted up until now, is it that they've done enough to convince us to keep them employed and sacrifice potentially bigger profits in our business? That's the dilemma, Nafi.
Well, it's so wonderful that you've answered that way, because you've almost scripted the next question. And it's also from Neil. And I'm going to read it verbatim, if you don't mind. The huge stimulus package that we'll need to get paid back over many years. And of course, this is not just a South African problem, that's a global problem, but specific to South Africa. How does South Africa find growth while taking 2 steps backwards and 1 step forward? We started this pandemic in a very different space to most of the world. How do we find our way out of this malaise? What's your view on that?
Well, 500 billion rand, let's say 600 billion rand, because there was a lot that came before it. 600 billion rand is being poured out of our existing budgeted public sector fiscus into the 600 billion rand, but at least 350 of that billion is coming from other governments, and particularly the BRICS Chinese government in particular. So the reality is we have a debt to repay. And remember, we took something like 60 billion 2 years ago from the Chinese. We don't know what cumulatively, 350 and 60 billion, let's make it around 400 billion. We don't know what was put up as surety for that money. But we do know that where billions have flown into other countries in Africa, and those countries have defaulted on those loan repayments, we do for a fact know that the Chinese government have started collecting on the debt and basically taking over ports, airports, and other infrastructure in those countries. Remembering that 10 years ago, the Chinese government said, we have a stated objective. We want to pour 2 million agricultural farmers into Africa every single year over the next 20 years. 2 million. Why? Because we see Africa as our breadbasket. That, by the way, is why the Chinese built a east-west corridor of roads, just like we had a north-south corridor of roads in Africa, so that we could shift all of our raw materials off to ports and off of the East Coast, shift it off to China. And now we have the Chinese people on the African continent who are essentially running those businesses and running those transport businesses to shift the raw materials quickly off to China as they can get it out of the ground or off of the trees. So that's the bottom line. The money is coming out of borrowing from foreign governments. But the problem is we don't know what surety was given to those governments. Was it Oliver Tambo Airport? Was it the Durban Harbour? We don't know what was put up as surety, and that's part of the problem. How do we fund? Well, I don't have to tell you. We are under-leveraged in South Africa in terms of our balance sheet, which means we have the capacity to fund a lot more borrowing than, in fact, we funded in the past, which is fantastic. It means we can borrow a lot, as long as we have a tax base which is servicing those loans and that debt, as has become apparent with how South African Airways essentially run out of runway in that regard. So the reality is we're going to see a lot more borrowing, at least over the next decade, to make up the money that has been lost now, because it's not going to flow in through the fiscus in terms of tax payments. It's just not going to happen in the short term. But the reality is, if whatever borrowing has taken place so far has to be accounted for, and whatever borrowing is taking place in the future has to be accounted for. And it shouldn't be that government is allowed to be the arbiter on what to borrow and what to offer as surety. It should be civil society, but that's not going to happen.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this last question is a particularly political one. It's a difficult one. And it's one that I think I'd love to have the articulation that you have to answer. Verbatim, the question is, Ivor's opinions that we are a racist country. What is the political future of that? And I think the real gist of this question is, are those comments that we are a politically driven country, which in Menachem Kay's opinion is a patent statement of fact because it's quite clear. But notwithstanding that, the question runs, are those your educated guess, or is this based on statistical surveys that have been done? I think you can hear my view in that one as well.
I'm not quite understanding the question. Is the question, are we a racist country? The answer is yes.
The question is, in your statement, and Menachem Kay 100% agreeing with you, that we are in a racist country built, predicated, and continued along racist lines. Is this our opinion based on conjecture or an educated guess, or is there statistical evidence of this? So, I mean, to me, quite clearly,
we have institutionalized racism, which as recent as a week ago, our constitutional court said was brilliant. It was okay. It was fine. We have institutionalized racism that allows black companies to benefit where white companies are not allowed now to benefit on racist grounds. And our constitutional court has said, perfect. Jody Colopin in the lower courts as a judge has said, perfect. So it's not conjecture. It's not something we're thinking about. It's there on the books, black and white. We have a country which is predicated on racist grounds.
You know, Ali, you said it before. You said it so beautifully. I'm a student of history. I love understanding history, and being a student of Jewish history in particular allows me to understand the context of where Jews were living at particular times in history and how they were viewed by the ruling party. And you said earlier on that we will remain, we might very well be able to make terrific livings. And you even said we might be able to protect our wealth, but we will be second-class citizens and will be viewed as such. And I can tell you that, there are many a time where, as a white person, I feel intimidated in certain environments that I find myself, because I find myself either on the defensive or physically intimidated. And that is, in my opinion, the mark of a second-class citizen. We all grew up in South Africa. We all know how black people were treated by white people during earlier parts and how they must have felt intimidated. Not must have, absolutely felt intimidated. Well, the tables have turned, and I think this is now not only state-sanctioned, but state-orchestrated. And I know that's a political statement and we should shy from politics, but facts are facts.
But Nachi, let me say this to you. I think that's the two brothers in the room, the Jewish and the Muslim communities, all right? Thrive
Octagon, we got United Nations going on here.
So we thrive on being second-class citizens. We fall apart. We fall apart when we become the noble elite in any country around the world. We thrive on being the underdogs and the second-class citizens. We are second-class citizens in the minds and the eyes of people who do not count. In our own minds and our own eyes and in our own esteem, we know the quality of what the Jewish person or the Muslim person is in their own community. So the bottom line is, we thrive on being second-class citizens. When things get too easy, that's when we fall apart as a community. And the bottom line is, you've got to take it from where it comes. You've got Ace Magashula calling a white person a second-class citizen. That's a bloody compliment in comparison to Ace Magashula.
Well, they haven't yet called us crooks, so that's something else.
They've been calling us crooks all the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I hand over
ask the Guptas who their accountants and their lawyers are, just to understand just how much we're earning that epithet.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure food for thought, finding positivity and finding reality in these difficult times. Ivor, I've got my father-in-law calling me. That is definitely as a result of what you're saying. I can assure you. This is a directly correlated.
Can I end off with this? Can I end off with one thing? You used the term positivity. You would have to be an idiot not to see opportunities in South Africa now. So not to see the opportunity of thriving in this disarray, not to see the opportunity of laying the groundwork for decades to come of benefit to you, your family, and the community you're in. You would have to be an idiot not to see those opportunities, because what you think you might be going to in the UK or America doesn't exist. But it exists here in South Africa. We understand the ground rules. We see the boundaries. We see the terrain. We can navigate the terrain. We are masters at navigating the terrain. There's nothing to give up in immigrating. They're not waiting for you.
No, Ivor, you put it so well. And it's long been my view, and I think by extension, because I think the other brokers at Octagon are in agreement with me, the Octagon House view, is that although the environment is a challenging one, daily new opportunities present themselves, and it's those who have eyes wide open that will find those realities. It's not to say that living in South Africa is easy, because in certain regards it isn't. Well, it's a bit easier to say that from living in a beautiful home and driving a magnificent vehicle and living in a wonderful climate and what. But having said that, the environment is getting more challenging, but opportunities continue to present themselves. So before I hand over to Steve Kraus to give us a wrap-up, I'd just like to, number one, take the opportunity to personally and from an Octagon standpoint, thank Dr. Ivor Blumenthal for, number one, his service to the community. Many of us are exposed to a lot of the work that he does. It is invaluable, and he is the only one doing it. So Ivor, a really sincere personal thank you from myself and from Octagon and from those whom I represent to you personally. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the listeners. Thank you very much for what you said. I know that if we had another hour, we would continue this, and I look forward to our next personal chat. I just want to remind everybody that this is now a weekly event. Every week, Thursday, 10 o'clock, we have our webinar. Our next webinar will be by the acting global CEO of PKF. That's the accounting group. As you guys know, Octagon Financial Services has long held an association with what is now called PKF Octagon, and their global head and one of their partners will be addressing us not about, if I can be very blunt, boring accounting stuff, but really about how to survive in these pretty difficult times. And we look forward to hearing them from them. And then I also just want to take a brief moment just to thank you, our clients, and to remind you that our offices are open, whether we are working from home or whether working from the office. We're available. We're around. Please be in contact. We'll be in contact with you as well. Stephen, over to you.
Yeah. Echoing, Nach, thank you for that close-up. Ivor, thank you for your time, for your insight. We are certainly living in a world of chaos, but your perspective does bring an element of clarity. A week ago, or just over a week ago, the world's most successful investor, Mr. Warren Buffett, held his AGM for his investors in Berkshire Hathaway, his company, and he closed off with the line that said, "Don't bet against America." And my interpretation of that is very much what we've been saying: don't bet against ingenuity. Granted, America is the bastion of capitalism and entrepreneurship, But hopefully the entrepreneurial element and the opportunities still exist. You sound still very upbeat about things here. I do too. I agree with you on that. So thank you for shedding light on those. But the waters around us remain stormy. They remain uncertain. This afternoon, we've got the Reserve Bank pronouncing on the next interest rate decision. Are they going to hold rates steady? Are they going to drop rates by 0.25%? Are they going to drop rates by 1%? There are always challenges that come our way. And our job collectively is very much to carve that path that navigates through these ever-changing times. And really that operative word being navigate, because we have to make it through. It's as simple as that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Everybody, thank you for your time and attendance at these. And we look forward to the next one. Have a great week and a great day ahead. All the very best.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.